today. The European Central Bank ventures further into negative interest territory, while the US dollar crumbles. Your host is Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Good evening and welcome to Liberties Report Week 36. The European Central Bank has announced new measures to tackle the European weak economy, which puts the current weak position of the whole global economy in the spotlight. This would normally just be something for boring people with boring words about finance. But this is starting to become cause for mainstream concern. And here's why.
On Thursday, the head of the European Central Bank again refused to start printing money without backing, so-called quantitative easing, against opinions of financial columnists worldwide. Instead, interest rates were lowered by 0.1%. One key interest rate fell to 0.05%. More notably, the deposit interest rate in the Eurozone fell from negative 0.1% to negative 0.2%.
Yes, that's right. Did you know banks are now so desperate to maintain this economy we have that they've gone to negative interest rates? Imagine that. Can I borrow a fantasy jillion at this interest rate, please? I only need it for like 15 minutes. I can stand right here at the counter with the money, if you prefer, sir, and hand it right back to you once the 15 minutes are up. Well, minus the accrued interest of several million, of course. There is this concept of what's money backed by, anyway, that comes into play here. Some say, for example, that the US dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. Is that supposed to be impressive? The United States went bankrupt over 40 years ago. More specifically, on August 15, 1971. It wasn't worded like that, of course. Like all politicians, President Nixon at the time had a way with words that made sure he was definitely not a crook. But the fact remains. A dollar used to be good for gold. 35 US dollars were exchangeable for 1 troy ounce of gold, as in the metal. That was a deal. A dollar was an IOU. It was a promissory note. But alas, the war bankrupted the United States. And we're not talking about the Iraq War here, not Afghanistan. No, we're talking about the Vietnam War. To fund it, the US printed far more money than what was covered by gold in the vaults. And some people noticed this. Francis Charles de Gaulle in particular, who saw the writing on the wall and demanded that the IOU were fulfilled. He demanded the promised gold for France's dollar reserves. And after some stalling, the then President Nixon provided that gold. But at that point, the vaults were practically dry. So, at this point, only one thing remained for the United States, and which was to declare bankruptcy. But that's obviously not the word that was used. Nixon merely declared that the United States, being the most powerful nation on the planet, simply wasn't going to pay back its debt. And that other countries could trade IOU notes, the US dollar, between them as they please instead. This event was named the Nixon Shock. The one word that was not used in the event was the one word that would have been used if anybody else had declared they would not pay back their loans. Bankruptcy. After that date, there was nothing holding back the dollar printing presses, and they've been going on overdrive since, selling US dollars in the form of government bond to a continuous stream of new creditors. That, obviously, needs to not run dry. There are people who are saying that we have a stable financial situation with a system that dates back to the 15th century. That's simply not true. This experiment of how much money can you print before the whole house comes crashing down on top of you is merely 40 years old. Since 1971, it's half a human lifetime. And last week at Liberties Report, week 35, we looked at how the US dollar was pegged to the oil trade. Some people are aware that during the US bank bailout, the federal government gave the banks $800 billion, but the Government Accountability Office found that this was peanuts. The real amount of money conjured out of thin air to stave off the crash just a little longer was an additional, astonishing $16.1 trillion.
How much is $16.1 trillion? The GDP of the United States is $16.7 trillion. The national debt is $17.7. And here's $16.1 trillion, for comparison.
So did this help? Injecting this much money into the economy? Well, the numbers say no, it didn't. Velocity of the US dollar pretty much halved. In other words, the $16 trillion went to, and stayed with, people who already had tons of money and liked to hoard even more, rather than ending up in the hands of people who circulated. And now, note now, this is not a 2-for-1 split we're talking about that benefits everybody, where you're getting $2 for every old dollar you had. This is where somebody decided to conjure 16 trillion out of thin air and give all of it to rich folks. This is the quantitative easing that people are pushing the European Central Bank to do. So, I don't give economic advice, but these numbers do not add up. The concept of printing money to get out of debt has been tried many times before in history, and that story just does not have a happy ending. It doesn't. Several experts are predicting that we're just on the verge of a major crash that'll end this 40-year experiment of free-rein money printing. Meanwhile, though, Bitcoin continues its stride. Tens of thousands of new locations outside of the legacy financial world have become Bitcoin-enabled recently. And if we're lucky, if Bitcoin matures in time, then that's our way out of this crisis. And certainly not printing even more money to pay off debt. I'm Rick Falkvinge, and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. Good night.